All right, well, we're going to do it. We're going to go there. We're talking about sex in recovery. Oh my gosh, we want to talk about it. We're scared to talk about it. We're embarrassed to talk about it. We're afraid. Well, guess who is not afraid or scared or embarrassed to talk about it? Jennifer Matesa, the author of Sex in Recovery, A Meeting Between the Covers. She comes on and has a conversation today sharing about the book, about her experience with addiction, and we're also going to get her to answer a few questions at the end. So stick around for this conversation. Check it out with Jennifer Matesa.
Here, we want to show you what's possible in the world of sobriety. We introduce you to the various tools, programs, and resources available, because there are way more options than you may even realize. We want you to find the one that works for you.
And we do it through people who share their pathway to recovery and will help you find your path to freedom. Because getting sober can feel hard enough. You don't have to do it alone. I'm Sarah Roberts.
And I'm Roger DeVoe, and this is Sobriety Starts Here.
Jennifer Matesa, I am so excited that you are here to talk with me today. This is a topic that I probably have avoided at times in my recovery. It's a topic that a lot of people have a lot of questions about. It's a topic that everybody can relate to. We are talking today with Jennifer Matesa about sex in recovery. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so awesome to be here with you.
I am so happy to have you here. I was saying when we first got started, we clashed a little bit. I thought I'd wear red because we're talking sex, and you wore gorgeous hot pink or fuchsia, and I love it. So luckily the camera is mostly going to be on you, but I did want to show the cover of the book. So Sex in Recovery, Jennifer Matesa. It's the subtitle is A Meeting Between the Sheets, and I love the play on words with
the covers. Everyone says sheets, it's covers.
Yeah, sorry.
That's
between
okay.
the covers. A meeting between the covers.
People often say that though. That's fine.
It's so funny how it's just like, that's kind of what came to mind. So Sex in Recovery, let's talk about the book and who it's for and why you wrote it, Jen. So go ahead, you let us know, why did you decide to go ahead and write this book?
Well, I decided because Hazelden had asked me to, Hazelden is the publisher of this book and the previous book. I have 4 books, and the previous one that I did before this was about physical recovery from addiction. And they had seen an article I had written about some triathletes who used exercise to stay sober. And I said, well, if we're going to have a book about exercise, we have to have a book about eating and nutrition, which I know you're fond of, and meditation, and also sexuality and pleasure, and sleep. So when I went on tour and I talked to audiences about that book, everybody wanted to talk about sex. And so when Hazelden, which I was astonished. I mean, I'm there, I am standing on stages and people are asking me about sexuality, and a guy is crying saying, I've never seen, a guy with 40 years is crying saying, I've never seen a woman stand on stage and talk about vaginas and orgasms, and I just felt like, wow, I'm onto something. This is important. People really need to have a space opened about this. So Hazelden came to me after that book was published and said, what do you want to write next? And I said, I want to write about sexuality. So what I decided to do, and I'm so happy that they went for it, was to interview 36 ordinary people in recovery about their sexual histories. And I could have interviewed more. Not one person I asked said no to me. I mean, it's just incredible generosity. People sat with me from between an hour to 3.5 or 4 hours telling me about their sexual histories, essentially what it was like before, what happened, and what it's like now with regard to sexuality. And
I think, Jen, I think it's amazing how generous they were in wanting to share their stories, but I think it's a testament to the greater conversation and the need for those kinds of conversations. I think it really speaks to the point that we need to talk about this stuff. We want to be able to talk about this, to talk about sex and intimacy, but we don't know how to do it. And so when someone like you, who's open and gracious and compassionate and unafraid and not embarrassed in any way to talk about this stuff up on a stage, I think that really opens the door for other people to say, oh my gosh, I really have a lot to say about this and I didn't even know how much.
That's right. That's right. They would go on and they would say, am I talking too much? I'm like, you can say whatever it is that you need to say. I negotiated with each of them about, the details that needed to be changed. I let every single person whose story was published read their story. I transcribed every interview, which, if you've ever transcribed interviews, you know how time consuming that is. But they would get to the end and say, I feel so much better. Like, I feel so much better just having told you all this. And I never even talked about it before with anybody. So yeah, you know, when you read the book, and you know, because you've read the book starts out with a real difficult story. And I decided to do that on purpose. It's a pretty traumatic story, a woman who experienced sexual trauma when she was 4 years old, at the hands of, you know, somebody in her family. And I decided to do that because trauma is so much a part of so many people's stories, not just women's, but, you know, men's stories. But the fact is that 75% of women in recovery, any kind of recovery modality, have some kind of trauma, you know, physical trauma or sexual trauma. And then a good portion of those have sexual trauma. And then like, I don't know, 25% of those have childhood sexual trauma. So these just are, it's just so much, it's so important. Once you take the substances away, these memories start coming back, because you're no longer numbing yourself and occupying yourself with the obsession anymore to get rid of the pain of the trauma. So it's just so important to pay attention to these memories and take care of ourselves when they come back. And part of that is just talking to people.
I really appreciate the approach that you took with this book, and that you did use these interviews. So the way that the book is structured is, you've got, you know, there's so much science backing your words and the research that you did to put into the book, but then you're also pulling out from the different people's stories. So how many people are in the book? I know that you know, connected with so many of the people in there, but I think that at least a dozen stories in the book.
There are 11 or 12, and then there are 10 or 11 subjects that I talk about. But yeah, none of them are composites. They're all real people's stories. I did change identifying details so that they couldn't be identified. And they're not just from my city. Some of them are from my city, but some of them, you know, I interviewed in other cities across the country. I networked to find people who, you know, I don't know any trans people in recovery in my city. So I networked to find somebody who is trans who would talk to me about her experience. And I interviewed, you know, a major gang member who'd been in prison. I mean, I went to lengths to get a real diversity of people so that this book would speak to a lot of different experiences.
Well, and it certainly delivers in that way, where I found myself even connecting with several different people's stories, just elements of several different people's stories.
I bet you connected with some men too.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Oh yeah. And that's what's beautiful about it, is that you really start to realize that we all, there are so many similarities within all of our stories. And that's such a powerful piece. And I know that you end the book in that way, where it's about the way to improve our relationships with ourselves and with other people, and the way to get to the root of our own sexuality and desire, and what makes the whole thing work is through connecting with others and telling our stories. So I think it's just such a beautiful way that you've put it all together in this book. It truly is groundbreaking. I don't think there is much else out there in the recovery space when it comes to sex in recovery. A Meeting Between the Covers by Jennifer Matesa. I encourage anybody right now to get out there and buy it. Where can you find this book, Jen?
Well, you can find it in Barnes & Noble, and also Amazon has the book. You can go straight to Hazelden's site, or your local bookseller will be able to either have it or order it for you. So, you know, it's offered by a major publisher, so it's out there.
Wonderful. So I wanted to now get into your story, and sort of, it'll bring us full circle to where you are today and why you decided to write Sex in Recovery. But let's get started on your recovery journey. If you want, you can start way back at the beginning in childhood, or you can start and pick up at whatever point you'd like to. This is your opportunity to share your story, Jen.
Wow. So, so if I were to share with respect to sexuality and recovery, I would just say that I was raised in a really strict Catholic family, a kind of immigrant ethnic Catholic family, I went to Croatian Catholic Church for the first 14 years of my life. My entire extended family on my father's side is Croatian. Many of them spoke Croatian. My grandmother, you know, spoke Croatian probably better than she spoke English. And it was just part of the culture of our family, not just the religion, but the culture, that, you know, the religion was and the culture were intertwined. So when I found myself unable to go to the Catholic Church anymore when I was in my early 20s. I wasn't quite sure why, but I knew it had something to do with sexuality, you know, the sexual inequities in that church, how women could never rise to the top of leadership. They didn't have the same kinds of power that men did. And, you know, of course, then there were the sexual abuses that came out later. I just couldn't do it. But, you know, I was drinking at that time. In my mid-20s, I started using painkillers because I had a great deal of pain. My family was not into taking care of ourselves at all. We didn't eat very well. We ate tons of sugar when I was growing up. We didn't have pop in the house, but we had Twinkies, which, I mean, betrays how old I am.
That's okay. People are still popping Twinkies.
I think they still have Twinkies, but it's not the thing anymore. I was a real 60s and 70s kid. And so, you know, I grew up overweight. I entered puberty late, but when I did, I suddenly became pretty, and I got all kinds of attention from boys in college, and I didn't understand at all. I wasn't prepared at all for how to control that, or how to manage it, how to even approach it, and how to approach my own desire, because it awoke my desire. So I drank. That was one way I dealt with it. When I had migraines, I drank. I didn't understand how to take care of myself. And I think over and over, as I listen to people's stories who are trying to recover from any kind of substance use disorder, it seems like they didn't learn really how to take care of themselves early on in life. So I was the kind of person, I found this out when I started interviewing for this book. I found out a lot of women, a lot of girls, women when they were girls, went out and tried to sort of take control of their sexuality by having a lot of sex.
Yeah.
And I was the opposite. But this is a thing. I mean, Peggy Orenstein, the writer Peggy Orenstein, has a wonderful book called Girls and Sex. I think I might cite it a few times in this book. It's not necessarily relevant to recovery per se, but she talks about how girls today, she interviewed girls from ages 13 to 19, girls today will go out and have indiscriminate sex, trying not to have any feelings because they think that that's a way to take power, take control over their sexuality. And you hear that in the lyrics of the kind of music that they listen to. Yeah. So, you know, this was like a post feminist wave thing, I guess, that happened. And but I didn't take part in it because I found out while writing this book, I found out that in a lot of things in my life, I've been restrictive. Like I've been restrictive with food. I haven't been anorexic, but when I get nervous or when the shit goes down in my life, I sort of restrict. I restrict spending. Like a lot of people go online and spend, but I won't do that. I will restrict, and I restrict on sexuality. So I didn't lose my virginity, which I think is a ridiculous idea to begin with.
Yeah, you talk about that a lot in the book. I really like that part.
Well, it's a ridiculous idea because, first of all, it only applies to hetero people. The tab A slot B idea, which is the idea of losing virginity. So it excludes.
Meaning tab A goes into slot B.
That's right.
That's the definition of sex. Yeah.
That's right. So there are lots of ways to begin. I mean, I began to see sexuality when I was writing this book as a spectrum. Beginning when we first feel our own sexual feelings in our bodies when we're little children. And of course I was taught that masturbation was a sin, a mortal sin. I masturbated once when I was 16 and it felt so good. I mean, that's one way I know that I have a really strong sexual response is because that one incident at age 16 felt so good that I promised God I would never do it again. And I did not do it again for like 6 years, which is insane. Like insane, right? How can you...
So because you felt that it was dirty and wrong.
I thought, you know, if I get hit by a car tomorrow, I'm going to hell, you know? But at the same time that I left the church, I started, you know, I actually did lose my virginity, and I started to masturbate, and I started to feel myself as a sexual person. But it also, like, I was also entering adulthood, and I didn't really know how to take care of myself in adulthood. I wasn't really prepared to manage my life, decide what I was going to do on a daily basis. How was I going to spend my money? How was I going to save my money? I would just save it all. I wouldn't spend any, unless it were on something that I could really make by hand. And I felt like I had to earn every pleasure that came my way, earn it twice or 3 times over. So anyway, at that time, like in my mid-20s, I started having really bad migraines. I mean, my migraines had hit when I was 14 when I got my period, but they became really bad once I entered adulthood. And I was by that time in graduate school for the first time at a university, at the University of Pittsburgh. And I went to one of the clinics, you know, and they started giving me all kinds of different drugs, including some opioids. I saw a couple of different doctors, not by choice. They kept referring me back to different people. It wasn't like I was doctor shopping. But I could tell that the opioids really, there was some kind of affinity that my body had for the opioids, you know. They gave me other things too that worked. Mostly what worked, and I've written about this too, was like anything that brought my shoulders down, because my shoulders tend to creep up toward my ears when I get upset, and I have really wide shoulders. So anything that kind of relaxed my body, and kind of opioids kind of give you a glow in your belly, and it made me feel warm and relaxed, and that's what worked for me, because I did not know how to take care of that tension that I felt in my body. So yeah, so I took a number of different opioids and barbiturates and SSRIs and tricyclics and all sorts of anti-seizure medications, all sorts of medications trying to get rid of these migraines, for, I don't know, 6 or 8 years. And then I got pregnant, and I didn't really understand. I didn't understand what was happening to me. People ask me, you know, when do you think you got addicted to these? I think probably I got really addicted after I had my son and the headaches, and my mother, and we moved house twice, and my mother died. I mean, all those stresses within 3 years. My body just kind of broke down, and I was diagnosed also with fibromyalgia. So then they started prescribing heavy duty opioids like morphine.
So can I stop you for a second and backtrack just a little bit to share with us? So obviously, you're in a relationship and you've gotten pregnant and had a baby. So it seems like, were you in touch with your sexual self, you know, in your later teens, or when did you start having sex and enjoying it, or were you enjoying it? Like, how did sex kind of play in when you first got out there?
What a good question. When did you start having sex and start enjoying it? Okay, so I always, like, the first guy I had sex with, I was 22. I mean, the first guy I had sex with was my boyfriend in college, but we didn't put tab A into slot B, but we had a lot of sex, and I always liked it. And he was really loving to me. And the fact that I could not let him put tab A into slot B, like in later years, just freaked me the fuck out. I was like, whoa, why couldn't I, like, especially after I got into recovery, I was like, why couldn't I let this happen? You know, he loved me, and I loved him. So what was the deal? So
what was the deal? Do you remember?
The deal was, I found out when I got into recovery, was that I had always not had sex when other people didn't want me to have sex. And I always had sex when other people wanted me to have sex. So it was always this thing of like making sure other people, I was doing what was expected of me. And it was not, I can't, that doesn't play out across the board. I can't say that every time I had sex with every partner, it was because that person wanted me to have sex. I also wanted to have sex, but largely that was the dynamic that was happening inside of my body. I didn't really own my body until I got sober. I mean, getting sober was the first act of saying, I'm going to take care of this house that I'm in, and feed it well, and exercise it well, and rest it well, and let it have pleasure. And that's what I started talking about in the book about physical recovery. Those are all the modalities that I talk about in that book.
Yeah, and we should mention it. It's called The Recovering Body, and it is an excellent book. I have not finished it. I have it, and I will finish it. It is excellent. It truly is, and it's really just talking about those main tenets of health and wellness that you know that I'm passionate about. So yeah, it's brilliant. And
it's just so hard. Thank you for saying that. So kind. It's so hard to take care of those things when you're in early recovery, when you're in detox, especially from opioids. You can't sleep. you have like spontaneous orgasms. So you don't know what, I mean, guys actually have spontaneous orgasms. Like I've talked to guys who have in rehab, like had sex with 3 different women every day while in rehab. Like they would meet them places and have sex with them. And when they weren't doing that, they were having spontaneous orgasms, because that's how much opioids tamp down your sexuality.
Wow.
And people don't realize that. And the same happens in opioid maintenance therapy. And I'm not dissing harm reduction at all. I believe in it. But we have to understand that people who are on high doses of methadone or Suboxone are having their sex hormones suppressed. And so it's a real consideration, not just from a pleasure standpoint, but from the fact that for women, when you're not having your period, or when you're having weird periods, it means that you're not having enough estrogen, which means that you're not getting protection from bone loss of bone mass. You could wind up with osteopenia, which I did, or even osteoporosis. So these are real concerns, and people need to think about them. I don't go on any medication at all, ever anymore, without asking my provider how it's going to affect my sexuality.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important question that I don't think most people just simply wouldn't even think to ask.
Well, yeah, and 25% of us women are on antidepressants, right? SSRI antidepressants that absolutely make it impossible for many of us to have orgasms. So I'm not saying that those they don't suppress sex hormones in the same way. They have different actions upon the central nervous system, but still, if you can't, I mean, I remember when I was on Prozac, my vagina just felt like a plate of rice. I mean, it just felt like stuff, that wasn't going to move on its own.
I've never thought to compare my vagina to a plate of rice.
Well, that's the way it felt. I remember really clearly, and I was in my 20s, and I'm thinking, this is really weird. I don't feel like I can't feel anything.
So let's stay there in your 20s. So we're in your 20s and you're in a relationship and you get pregnant and you have a child. So you have not been enjoying sex at this point because you've been on antidepressants on painkillers.
Yeah, I got on painkillers in my 30s actually, but I was on a lot of antidepressants in my 20s, and I had a lot of difficulty with sexual response in my 20s because of the whole religious thing, and because I didn't understand that I was entitled to my own body. And then I did get pregnant when I was 32 and had my son. And then all those other things happened and my body broke down, like in my early 30s. I mean, that's the way I think of it, is my body broke down around the time that my mother died. And then we moved house again. We moved when my son was 3 months old first. And then when he was 3 years old, we moved again. And I just couldn't take all the stress. And that's when I was writing at the time. I was doing consulting work for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which was a big funder of projects to get opioids out in the market. Like they had a project about end-of-life care that they were saying people at the end of life should be given opioids. But I was interviewing these physicians, the same ones who were promoting OxyContin. And so those guys said to me, you probably have fibromyalgia. I would tell them about my experience during the interview, and they said, you probably have fibromyalgia. You need to go to a pain clinic. And so I did. I went to, by that time, the University of Pittsburgh had a pain clinic, like a clinic just devoted to chronic pain, not just headaches or, neurology clinics. So I went there and they did diagnose me with fibromyalgia. And they said, yes, you have migraine too. And how about we give you some pure hydrocodone, which is the active ingredient in Vicodin, the opioid in Vicodin. So they gave me some of that. They started me out on, 30 or 60 milligrams, and that blossomed to 150 milligrams pretty quickly. And then my physician added morphine, long-acting morphine, to that mix. So within the first year, I was on 150 milligrams of essentially Vicodin Zero, which is what I thought of it as, Coke Zero is Coke without anything else. And Vicodin Zero is just the hydrocodone. So 150 milligrams of that, plus 120 milligrams of morphine. So that's a lot of drugs I was on. And my period disappeared. It went away, and I didn't feel like having sex. I did my work. I could sit for 4 hours and without like stretching, without taking care of myself, without eating. without
And I think it's a
drinking.
point to be made that when women do lose their periods, this is not something to ignore. This
It's
means that,
not.
right. So tell us
Yeah.
what it means when a woman loses her period.
Well, when I told my physician after about 6 months to a year of not having a period, hey, I'm not having a period, she flipped out on me in the consulting room, and she said, "Oh my God, we got to get you into a bone scanner. We need to know your bone density. You can't be 36 or 37 with no period because you lose bone density if you don't have enough circulating estrogen in your body." Um, and it's sex hormones do a lot of other stuff just besides regulate your period. They regulate your mood, they regulate your metabolism. It's just not good to go into early menopause and have hot flashes at 37 if your body is not wanting to do that on its own. So yeah, that's what happened. So she switched me. I was about 2.5 years into opioid therapy, as it was called. And she switched me to fentanyl, which is the drug that's in heroin and other drugs today. So she said, "How about we put you on fentanyl?" And I'd already been given, get this, I'd been given fentanyl lollipops. Okay, so they make fentanyl in lollipops. You pop a little sucker in your mouth and you get a nice dose of fentanyl for breakthrough pain, which I have breakthrough pain all the time, but to take fentanyl for migraine and fibromyalgia ain't the best medical practice, okay? But this was the culture in the 2000s when OxyContin came onto the market. You had big funders like Robert Wood Johnson and Purdue Pharma out there pouring money into big ad campaigns saying chronic pain shouldn't be suffered. And I agree, chronic pain shouldn't be suffered. But I think there are people with neurological problems that are much worse than migraine and fibromyalgia that actually do respond to opioids. Migraine and fibromyalgia actually don't respond very well to opioids. Yeah, that's the evidence. That's the science. So I was being given all these drugs, plus I was never screened for family predisposition to addiction.
So can I ask,
Yeah.
was your pain reduced from using these drugs, or did you just become addicted to the high of these drugs? Like, tell us what was going on.
It's a really good question. So at first, yeah. I would say in the first year, it really was. My tolerance climbed sky high, like I said, but just feeling like I had a method to control my pain, because my body really was in a great deal of pain. And it can be in a great deal of pain if I'm in a fibromyalgia flare. Like I have all these hard spots in my back and in my neck, and in the big muscles, like in my glutes, especially. Like I have to take care of those. But I had no way of knowing how to take care of those other than taking drugs. So just having an option, like I could take these drugs and it would kill the pain or make it easier for a while. But it also made me, like I knew I responded to opioids in a way, like I didn't feel high. Like people talk about getting high. I felt like I could function, and I felt like, I think opioids have always given me like an antidepressant effect. Like they made it possible for me to get out of bed in the morning. They made it possible for me to, like I have a friend who says that her house was never so clean as when she was on Vicodin. Like it made it possible for me to do 3 hours of housework without a break. It made it possible for me to get up at 6:30, have tea and toast, get my son up at 7, get him washed, dressed, fed into daycare, sit down to work at 8 o'clock, work for 4 or 5 hours without a break, get my son, do errands, take my son home, put him down for a nap, like just go all day. Yeah. And that's what, I mean, there were a lot of stories at the end of the 2000s, the beginning of the 2010s about women who took Percocet and Vicodin that way so that they could meet these unrealistic expectations that they put on themselves. So that's part of how I kept my weight down, how I kept my productivity up. But I didn't understand how much it was numbing me. Like I did not understand it was gradual. Like I say, my tolerance climbed, but it takes time to realize how much you lose, like how much sensitivity and subtlety and appreciation for beauty. I mean, it took me 3 or 4 years to realize that I didn't even really want to listen to music anymore. Like I didn't want to listen to music anymore. And the way that I found out was I would go into withdrawal and suddenly I was putting my iPod on and listening to music, and I'm thinking, what's happening to me? And suddenly I could have orgasms again, and I'm thinking, ooh, this is not good. Like I started putting two and two together, and it took me 4 years into heavy duty opioid use, and it took me 2.5 more years to actually quit them, because I was just writing about this today in response to an article that was in New York Magazine about fentanyl, that talked about how we get high on opioids. Like I wasn't getting high, I was getting numb. Like I was afraid of my feelings, you know, and I didn't know how to take care of them. And the way that I took care of them was I would just take drugs so that they didn't exist.
Did alcohol, I know that you talked a little bit about alcohol, and I know that you, when you decided to seek treatment, you chose Al-Anon as a way, because it was such a great program for you. Talk about a little bit about your alcohol use. I'm just curious about how that weaved into your story.
So I didn't really use alcohol that much after I started treating my pain with opioids. I don't know whether I was replacing one drug with another. I did crash my car when I was 22 or 23, when I was drunk. And I gave up alcohol after that for a while. And after that, like I didn't go out and compulsively get drunk. But so I think alcohol was just the first drug that came along. But when opioids really spoke to me, that's when the addiction started. Sometimes I wonder, I hesitate to say this because I know there are people out there who would like point fingers and say, oh, she's in denial. But, you know, I think different drugs work differently on different people's bodies. And, you know, I know alcohol always gave me migraines. It didn't particularly do the job for me. But it was, you know, it was part of my story. So yeah. Do a lot of people who come to your site use alcohol?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think that alcohol is the biggest one, but at the same time, we are seeing and hearing from so many people who it is opioids. I mean, you know, pills are the way for them. So definitely,
they're able to get pills. It's like really hard to get pills now.
I think that people find. Say that again. Sorry.
From what I hear, I mean, I have a friend who just had surgery 2 weeks ago, and she kept having to call for tiny refills of like 6 pills or 8 pills or whatever. So I think they're really restricting, they're withholding prescriptions for people even with surgery. So
I agree, but I imagine on the black market, things are, you know, there are lots of websites out there that I know that people can get access to, and they come in the mail.
Yeah.
You know, pills come in the mail.
Well, so like after I started taking pills, I just didn't, I mean, actually I was afraid to drink because I didn't want to die. And I think it's really bad advice to drink and use pills. But when I did get sober, I remember that my husband really didn't want me to call myself an alcoholic because he wanted me to be able to have like half a beer with him. He wanted me to be able to have like half a glass of wine with him. It was hard for me to help him understand that I had to like quit substances, you know, all substances. Cause he kept saying, you know, well, the stuff you were on was legal. And I'm like, yeah, but the stuff I was on was really making me unhealthy. So I think a lot of people, I mean, it's very tempting. Like people take control of their own healthcare. They take as much of their antidepressant as they think they ought to have. They take as much of, you know, over-the-counter stuff as they think they ought to have, and sometimes we take as much pain medicine as we think we ought to have, and that was really the start of my addiction.
So you talked about getting clean from opioids. How did you do that? Again, I know that you talked about it. I listened to a podcast not long ago where you were sharing that you used Al-Anon as a program, and then I know that you also used the 12 steps. But how did you decide that enough was enough and you were going to quit? Was there some type of rock bottom?
Well, in the middle of, so to talk about Al-Anon, it's hard for me to talk about that because I'm kind of anonymous about the 12-step programs that I've gone to, but I have written about Al-Anon and how helpful that program is. And I went to that because at the time I was taking like 1 or 2 codeine pills a day, and I would go to these meetings. This was back in the 90s. I would go to NA meetings and people would say, I talk about how they'd sold every last possession they had and they'd sold their bodies. And I just wasn't like that. I couldn't imagine myself doing that. I didn't see the commonality between me and them, except for the fact that we both took drugs compulsively. We didn't feel like we could do without our drugs. And then I would go to AA meetings, and I didn't drink anymore really. So I didn't feel like I could call myself an alcoholic. And I didn't understand that the only thing that you need to do is just to want to stop drinking to be able to be there. So the way that I got off drugs, because I really love the word sober for what it means, but the way I got sober is I had a kind of multi-level bottom. I mean, I had a couple of times that I went into withdrawal from fentanyl, and I was on the biggest patch they make, and I was abusing it. I was abusing it in ways that, I would cut patches up and put them in my mouth. I mean, it was just not good. And of course, my doctor didn't know that I was doing this. I don't know if anybody really knew, but just hiding that much behavior every day, like it was all day, every day, and just hiding something all day, every day, just made me insane. It made me really paranoid. And I also changed dates on prescriptions, which is a felony offense every time. And I'm sure I did it at least a dozen times. So I began to, I went into withdrawal, and the withdrawal was just ghastly. I couldn't function.
Did you go into withdrawal because you had decided for
yourself?
I ran out.
No, I ran out. There was no way that I could decide for myself. I ran out. It was 2005, I think, and I ran out, and it was September, and everything smelled like mildew. Like everything smelled. I could not eat. I could hardly get up out of bed. It was just awful, and it lasted a week because my refill wouldn't come in for a week, and so I told myself, I suffered minute by minute through that week, and I told myself if that ever happened to me again, I would go to rehab or do something about it. Wow. And of course it happened again. It took another 2 years for it to happen again, or a year and a half, but it happened again. And I thought, okay, so I'm going to go to rehab. And I called the rehab that is the best rehab around here. And I said, can you guys basically, I'm on the phone saying, basically, can you detox me now? Tell me how to detox. And they're like, we can't do that over the phone. You have to come in. Yeah. But we know somebody who can do that. So they gave me the name of a person. And then I called my PCP and said, I really need to get off these drugs, because she knew that I was on them. She wasn't the one prescribing them, but she knew I was on them. And she said, okay, so talk to this guy. And it was the same guy as the rehab had given me. So I thought, okay, that's two good sources recommending the same guy. So I called the guy, and he oversaw an outpatient detox, basically. And he did use Suboxone. So Suboxone did save my life. I mean, I could not have detoxed off fentanyl without going on to Suboxone for 2 months. But I'm so glad I did not stay on Suboxone, because I've heard so many stories of people especially whose hormones have gotten so out of whack on high doses of Suboxone, and who wind up not being able to function. I think the people who do best are the people who wisely, first of all, don't sell half their doses and use that to fund a heroin habit, and then use their Suboxone to tie them over between heroin uses, or people who can stick to a low dose, and the lowest necessary dose, and then also use some other kind of recovery program, some other kind of recovery modality, whatever it be. It could be yoga, it could be religion, it could be any discipline that brings some kind of health and sense of love and self-care into your life. So yeah, I spent two months on Suboxone, and then after that I was drug-free, and I had such a hard time, because I had started going to a 12-step program, and I didn't really build a community around myself, which I think is the basis of healing in the 12-step programs, is the love of the community, and the sense that you're given to and you give back. And that's what we're evolved to do in this life. We have to have that. And by the end of my addiction, I had nobody. I didn't have any kind of sense of community at all. I wasn't really being honest with anybody. And I didn't really, it had gotten difficult between me and my husband, because, you can't lie and hide with somebody all the time and have really a productive relationship. Um, and that's a different story. But anyway, I did have a difficult time for a year.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to really take care of myself. Like, I think it does take, like, when you're on that level of drugs, I mean, I was on 100 micrograms of fentanyl per hour, 24/7. I mean, that's the equivalent of like 500 milligrams of morphine.
Oh my gosh.
And when you're on that high a level of opioids, it just takes time for your nervous system to reset and heal. And the things that that I found that were most helpful to me were the things that I wrote about in my book about physical recovery. So when I started to eat really well, when I started to exercise, especially aerobic exercise and stretching, like weightlifting, that really helped normalize my own endorphin production. When I started to get really good and restorative sleep and protect my sleep, because my sleep rhythms had really been out of whack. So when I did those things for myself, I really started to get better and I got stronger. I did 2 rounds of P90X. So for 180 days, I was doing P90X. I could do like 150 push-ups on my toes during an hour workout. You know, so I proved to myself that I was a lot stronger than I thought I was. And so the whole, so the whole thing about owning my body, that's when I learned that. That's really when I felt like I recovered, was I made choices to really be inside my body. And that's what those 2 books are about, are really like bringing oneself back to the body and listening. What does your body need? What is your body telling you that it needs?
And that's such a scary thing. Sorry, and that's such a scary thing for so many people, because so many of us, and I think even you included, would agree that you had abandoned that side, your own feelings for so long. Like as a child, you masturbated once at 16 and that was it. It was like, and
I didn't think of that as an abandonment, though. I thought of that as self-protection. Like, I'm not going to go to hell, right? But yeah, but when I made the decision to create my own values and live by them, that's when I started to really heal. And I think that, like, and that's still going on for me. Like, it's still like, I'm just now starting to feel like I'm cultivating a sense of being held, like, and being held in safety from within and from without. Like, I had a really extraordinary experience a couple of weeks ago after I meditated, and I was just studying, I was reading, and I had this sense of arms inside of me and outside of me. They were inside and outside at the same time. Wow. And they were holding me around my middle. And I felt the sense that I could relax because something had my back, and that something is myself. Wow. So yeah, so it's still going on, like it's still evolving. It just takes, it takes a commitment to really listen to oneself and do what one thinks is best for oneself. I mean, and this is hard because, like, the 12 steps have saved my life. I also think that for a while, I used the 12 steps in place of, like, I did what other people expected me to do in the 12 steps, and it was like the whole drama all over again. Like, I just did what I was expected. Yeah. And that's like there's a high that I got off of that, or there was like a false sense of safety that I got off of that. And really the safety that I'm seeking now is the safety that is my inborn birthright, that was in me, that has been in me since I was born, since I've been a human being, whenever the start of that was. And other things covered it up and disabled it, and then I covered it up and disabled it. And now, like, I'm letting that come out more and more, and it's just unfolding like a flower.
So you mentioned meditation. What
Yeah.
else, if somebody's seeking and wanting to get closer to who they really are and they're struggling with connecting with themselves, what would you suggest? I know your book, The Recovering Body, touches on those main tenets of really, really restorative sleep and movement and nutrition and meditation. But what would be other things that you might recommend to people, or are those the main ones that you think are how we get closer to who we really are?
Well, I think those things bring us, I mean, meditation I included as a physical practice because that book is full of physical practices, like things that we do with our bodies. And when we meditate, we put our bodies onto the cushion or onto a mat or into whatever pose. And then we focus on our breathing, or we focus on our third eye, or we focus on whatever, like we bring ourselves back to our bodies in meditation. And that particular discipline may be more than others. I mean, I don't know. I know people who would say that exercise is really their meditation and it's their way of connecting with their spirit and their higher self or whatever, getting insight. But I think that any practice, it could be painting, it could be drawing, it could be, I think especially making things, not necessarily always taking things in from the outside, but making things and creating things, things that, disciplines that require us to imagine and put us in touch with our sort of intuitive capacity.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And a few people on that have come and have had conversations, excuse me, with me, Sandra Primo and Tammy Salas, they talk a lot about
their podcast is great.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, the Unruffled podcast. So good. So, okay, can we keep going with your story? So so I want to know though, when did you decide, and I want to talk I want to kind of delve into sex more, but I want to know, when did you decide to go ahead and use the 12 steps or to use a 12-step program for yourself? Again, you said that you didn't align with NA before, and you didn't feel that you were an alcoholic. So when did you decide, I don't care that I'm not an alcoholic, the only prerequisite for membership is to say that I no longer want to use alcohol? So when was it that you decided to do that?
Well, I'd had 10 years of experience in Al-Anon by the time that I decided that I had to do this detox. It was Labor Day of 2007, 2008. And so I knew a lot of people whose partners were in AA, and I'd gone to open AA meetings. I had heard people speak their qualifications, their leads, and I most of all could see that it worked, that they were living lives that were good for them, and they were no longer enslaved by substance, that had enslaved them. So yeah, when I was detoxing, it was like 2 or 3 weeks into detox, I was on Suboxone. I was having some stress, and I thought, oh my God, I need to take something for this. And I realized I was not going to be doing that anymore. Like that was not going to be my discipline. And I realized I like actually fell off the chair that I was sitting on. And I realized that I was going to have to get some more help. Like I couldn't just do this detox. I couldn't just say I was a pain patient and I wanted to reduce my tolerance, which is what I told the detox doctor. And by the way, he said he'd never seen a patient who was so motivated to like quit drugs as I was. So I was really doing it. Like I was decreasing my dosage. I was being responsible. But I called a person in AA, and that person called back and talked to me for free while I cried and said, oh my God, I'm an addict, and I don't know what to do. And then that person said, well, call this person because that person has a story a lot like yours. And I called that person, and that person called back for free. And I'm thinking, who are these people who call back for free? Like for free, they're helping. So that person agreed to sponsor me in a 12-step program, and over the phone, sight unseen, which I thought was remarkable. That person ended up relapsing, like taking drugs again. And I didn't quite know what to do. There's not much, like people don't usually talk about what to do when your sponsor relapses. And I got all kinds of conflicting advice. But after that, I started really that was at the same time that I started taking care of myself And I just decided that I would have to work with somebody who, you know, was pretty stable in recovery. And so I did. And I did that while I was taking care of my body. And the sexuality thing, I'm not quite sure how to talk about that, because that has to do with my marriage, and my marriage has ended. That wasn't something that I wanted. I didn't want my marriage to end. I really tried to get it to work. And so did he. We really worked at it. But there were a lot of things, there were a lot of conflicts and fractures in that relationship that got covered up by my drug use and by the way that we related when I was using. And when I stopped using it, it tipped things. And I couldn't make it go back. I couldn't make it go back, and we couldn't find a way forward. So yeah, and I will say this though, that when people detox from opioids, like my libido came roaring back. I thought I was 16 again, and I was like ready to masturbate and forget about promising God I wouldn't do it. I was ready to do a lot of different things. I bought a Vibe while I was in my addiction too, and I wanted to use that, and I wanted to do a lot of things. And so it's really important to understand that giving up the substances can destabilize a relationship. And it can bring out all kinds of, like, it can bring out strengths, and it can bring out weaknesses. And when one person changes in a relationship, when one person gets into recovery, the entire relationship is going to change. I heard that over and over again from people that I really trusted in recovery. It's a little crazy making though, because one of the basic texts in 12-step recovery talks about how, you know, things will really work out. Feuds of long standing will just disappear. Conflicts will heal themselves. And that wasn't happening. Like for me, that wasn't happening. Like I had 2 situations in my recovery that were really like long amends making processes, in which I didn't talk to one of the people I didn't talk to for 2 years, and I just prayed for this person. So yeah, it was like not happening in my marriage. And I have to say that one of the biggest challenges in recovery for me has been to like not hold it against whoever's running this planet or this universe, that my marriage disintegrated, because I really didn't want that to happen. But I'm
really sorry that is happening, and just know that I'm sorry for that, because I know that that's not what you wanted.
No, I appreciate that. He didn't want it either, but the fact is that we're both in other relationships that are really good. Like I've been in a relationship for over 3 years. That is a really good relationship. Like it's really good. And so like another weakness that I've come to understand about myself in recovery is that I tend to hang on to things too long. Like I hung on to so many things that were bad for me for so long, including drugs, and bad for other people too. And so, you know, this relationship has been full of like joy and exploration and negotiation of conflict, but in healthy ways. And we just got back from, you know, 4 days in the desert, which was awesome. I mean, we hiked 7 or 8 miles a day, and we laugh a lot, and there's a lot of exploration, and a lot of it is very sensual, and a lot of it is about still unfolding and still talking about what we want, what we imagine. I think that's one of the most important things I found out about writing Sex in Recovery is it's so important to talk about sexuality. It's so important to like talk while you're naked with someone. I'm sorry to cover up my face, but it's still kind of wild for me to think that this is possible. Like I could take off my clothes, get in bed, and actually talk with somebody about what I want.
Yeah.
And hear what they want. Yeah.
So I love that. Let's kind of go down that road a little bit for so many people who are newly sober. And I know for me, when I first got sober, the thought of having sober sex, I had never had sex ever. So when I first had sex, I was young, I was in my early teens, and it wasn't a great experience. And
but you still drank? You drank or you used or something?
Always.
Yeah.
Always. I was never
like at 14 or whatever. Yeah.
I was 15 when I first drank and 16 when I first had sex. And I never had sex or any type of sex without being under the influence, for sure.
I heard that so many times from so many people. I remember talking to a young woman who was in her 20s at the time. This was 3 years ago, and I thought it was going to happen with this guy. And I said, I think it's going to happen. She's like, oh my God, you have to tell me how it is, because I still haven't had sex, and I have like 3 or 4 months sober, and I still haven't had sex, and I've never had sober sex. Like she was 28. Yeah. So
really common story with people in early recovery who go years without it, because again, we know how to do it when we're under the influence.
We know how to do it a certain way
for
when
sure.
we're under the influence.
Totally.
But it's so like, tell me how it was like not the same as sober sex.
Oh my gosh. I mean, for me personally, sex under the influence was never about me. It was always about them. It was always about making sure that they got everything that they needed.
And also that you looked awesome enough for them to like be okay with you. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. And you talked earlier about that control and that feeling of, it's almost this feministic vision that we have where we decide that we're going to have, it's going to be consensual, it's going to be casual, it's going to be no strings attached. That kind of feeling around having sex with guys was made me pretend to myself that I was in control. And what I knew for sure is every single time it happened, that the next day or even immediately after, I regretted it. I felt awful. Usually I was too drunk right after to notice that. But the next day I would feel ashamed. I'd feel embarrassed. I wish that it wouldn't happen. I was labeled slut in high school. I mean, the list goes on with how I used sex, I thought, as a way to control. And yet, and I would try to win. It was always about winning the guy. It was always about, I'd be at the bar, I'd see a guy, I'd think he was hot. Finally, he'd notice me, we'd get together and we'd sleep together. And that was how it went for,
I've heard that a lot too. Yeah. A lot about like ensnaring, like not trapping, but like catching him.
And that feeling of winning, that feeling of having won. And then the sex
like
again
score.
was the score. And then it was just all about them. It was truly never, ever about me. And I know that so many women in your book talked about that too, where it was just performing. It was performing.
Well, yeah. And so what that young woman was really saying to me was, tell me how sex is without performing. Tell me how it is when you're actually looking somebody in the face or actually using sex to, like, I didn't know what sex was for. And I discovered that it's for communicating in ways that you cannot communicate in any other way. Like you cannot, how do I say this? It's saying things or communicating feelings that are impossible to communicate in any other way. Yeah. And I know, I mean, that may sound trite, but it's the truth for me. And I guess I'm afraid that I come off sometimes sounding a little bit too naive, like people, I know people who use kink that way, like they use bondage that way. That's like, you can use all kinds of sexual, an entire repertoire of sexual expression to say things that you can't say in other ways.
What would be your recommendation for people who are newly sober? How can we get comfortable with the idea of having sober sex?
Oh my God, have sober sex with yourself first. Have sober sex, like just start out by touching a part of your body that you haven't touched in a long time. And just let your hand rest on that part of your body, whatever it might be. It could be your arm, it could be your breast, it could be just your belly, it could be anything. But just let your hand be there and really feel it. And then maybe bring a toy into your play, but play with your own body. And I'm not saying do it as a discipline, don't set your timer or whatever, you can if you want, but that's where it starts, is communicating with yourself and finding out what you really like. And then you'll be able to tell a partner, you know what, I really like X, Y, Z.
And that might take a year. Like I find a lot of women that I'm connected with, and men too, but mostly women are the ones talking about this, that they're pushing themselves to get out there because friends are saying, get out there and start dating. And we're scared to even date, because we kind of know that part of the dating seen is having sex, and we're afraid, we're scared to do that. So I think that's really good advice, to get really comfortable with our own bodies and our own selves and what turns us on. And I will mention, Roger actually recently bought something for us online and from a sex store, and not because we don't like going to sex stores together, or shops, but it was just something that he saw online, and he was like, "Oh, let's try this." So that was something cool that we're going to explore in our relationship. But the point was just that you don't even have to go out and go to a sex shop to find a vibrator that you like. You can get them online based on really good recommendations.
Yeah, you can't. It helps if you've never seen a vibrator before. It helps to probably see one live, just to see what they look like, so that you can tell. I mean, there are all kinds of different kinds, but I've ordered, like, I have a glass toy that I bought from China, and I ordered it from China. I don't even think it's available anymore, which is too bad. But it's like a wonderful glass G-spot tickler, and it's a great toy. And I just, I think sometimes, like, I don't have that many toys. I'm talking like I have a whole closet full of toys, but I have a few really, like, I started out with a rabbit that was Sex and the City rabbit pearl that Charlotte used. And I had one of those, and then it wore out, and then I had another one. But I have some toys that I really like. And I think it helps to see one live if you've never seen, if you're kind of afraid. But, if you have money and you want to splurge, just go and get yourself a couple toys. You can buy them on Amazon.
I know, that's the thing. It's becoming easier and easier for us to make sure that we can tend to our needs. And I think that's just, the kind of the key of all of it is, once we get sober, all of a sudden we're open and raw and vulnerable, and we just sort of don't know anything about ourselves. Like, I found, for me, you even talked about it in the book and even in this conversation, where trying to kind of get back to knowing who you really are and what you feel and what you think about, and all of these things are all, it's such treacherous territory when we first get sober and start to peel away those layers, and sort of all of that numbness starts to go away, and we're thawing out, and sex is just that other thing that it feels so daunting. It feels really daunting. I think that we can all get on board with meditation and yoga and eating better and exercising, and all of those things seem easier. But when it comes to relationships, especially for those, well, both ways, I was going to say, especially for those who are in relationships where you get sober while you're in a relationship, because your partner has these preconceived ideas of how you are in bed, and how things go in your relationship.
And you might have faked orgasm for 5-10 years,
my whole life.
Yeah,
I faked every single one.
But I mean, with a partner for that long. So essentially, you've been teaching your partner, this is how to do me, or this is how to get me off, and we're not really how you like it.
So what do we do? How do we tell them that we've been lying this whole time? How do we have that conversation?
Well, I mean, I think that what helps in that situation, I was just thinking this when you were talking about, the fear, is having a community around you. So I asked people, a lot of women in recovery, when I was really working on getting sober and trying to work on my marriage, how to negotiate that territory. So this is why I've started this secret group on Facebook called Sober Sex for Women. And it's even sometimes a little hard to start discussion in that group, because everybody wants to read, but hardly anybody wants to take the risk of actually posting something there. But when people do post, oh my gosh, have you read some of the responses in that group?
It's incredible.
They're incredibly honest and vulnerable and helpful in a practical way. So you can join that group if you're a woman. It would be awesome if we could figure out how to start a group for men. But that's definitely a resource for women.
It's an amazing resource. I'm glad you mentioned it. So if people do want to join that secret Facebook group, you can't find it anywhere. So you'll have to find Jennifer Matesa on Facebook and send her a message that way. And then she can add you to the secret group. So it is amazing. It is a resource. It is just a way to know that none of us are alone. We can all feel like we're so alone. I remember reading My Secret Garden by
Nancy Friday.
Yeah.
Back when I had a few favorite stories in that book.
They're great stories, and so they're fantasies, you know, written by women that they share. And so I got that book back in my sort of mid-20s, early 30s, where I was really trying to navigate my own sexuality and trying to figure out, what do I actually like? What makes me tick? Like, what is it that turns me on? And I was finding it really, really challenging, because again, for all of my life up until I got sober at the age of 29, it was always just about a conquest. It was about getting that guy, getting that person. And I had lots of long-term great relationships, but sex was always about them, not me. Doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy it a lot of the time as well, but I definitely knew that it was not about me. This was definitely a power play, and it was me submissing in a way, to make sure that they got whatever they needed out of it. And then again, for me, it feels like I almost find like it might be easier if you're single in early sobriety, so that then you can kind of start fresh. And that's how, when I first got sober, I was in a relationship. We had to navigate all of that, but we ended that relationship. And then I was single for 3.5 years before meeting Roger. And I really feel that during that time, I did not have sex. I mean,
yeah, that's another thing, is just spending time with yourself. Like I did not have sex for 2.5 years, and
yeah.
it was really helpful.
Me too.
Yeah.
I find that sometimes we might put too much pressure on hurrying up and getting up, because we're worried that we're going to forget how to do it, or we're not going to know how it
People
works.
do worry about, oh my God, does it still work? You know, I think, you know, I say this too, when I've given talks about this, like, practice sex can be really helpful. Like, I don't know if you know what I mean, but just sex with somebody that you know, that you trust, who maybe isn't like a romantic interest, but who you know and trust. It can just help, like, ease your fear so that the stakes aren't super high. Yeah, like I don't mean to like demean it or denigrate it by saying it's practice, because it doesn't have to be, that doesn't mean that it means any less to the partners. Everybody needs to be on the same page about what it means, you know, but just consensual sex, it's maybe one-off or something that happens between you and a person that you really trust, that can just help you understand, yeah, everything's cool, it's going to be okay, you can, you know, everything will work when the time comes when you really want to use it with somebody that you want to be with. Or if you just,
so interesting.
You know, in whatever way that you want to do. I mean, I understand that people have sex without having relationships too, and that's their choice. So
yeah, I've never really thought about doing that. Just having somebody that you really like and trust. And
well, it just happens sometimes.
for sure it does. Yeah, no, and I kind of like it. I think that I'm nervous by that, because I think of usually it seems to me that every time I've tried to engage in that kind of thing, they either are falling harder for me than I am for them, or the other way around, and it doesn't usually work. But I think that in the right context, that can be a really good way to go about it. Yeah, I like that advice.
Yeah.
I want to talk.
Also, just one more thing. You talked before about stories. I think you mentioned something about stories. I think erotica, like, a lot of people are intimidated by porn or just don't like porn, but erotica can be really, really cool. So yeah, My Secret Garden by Nancy Friday is an oldie but goodie, but there's a lot of other erotica out there.
I was wondering if there are some other.
So one of my favorite books, and I got this ages ago, but I still like it. It's kind of old fashioned. It's called the Olympia Reader. And it's a book of stories that were published in like the 1950s in like overseas where they weren't censored or whatever. And there are a couple of stories in there that I really like, a few stories that I really think are awesome. And it all depends on what turns you on. Like, some people are turned on by like stuff that's way out of, like, that could never happen in real life, like bestiality. And then other people are turned on by things that like are just really could happen in real life, like just real romantic stuff. So it really depends. Like, I think you need to just look at book previews on Amazon and just figure out what is your style.
And so I kind of like that you're even using the words, you know, bestiality and things that might turn you on in fantasy. And it doesn't necessarily mean. It
doesn't have to be that you want to actually go screw an animal. It doesn't have to mean that. It doesn't mean that, actually. Sometimes
it might, but
our sexual responses are like, we have so much to discover. And this culture does not want us to discover it. It does not want us to talk about it. It doesn't want us to be who we are. It wants to control us by selling us stuff. I think, and I think sobriety and recovery are all about taking that control back and deciding who like how we're going to do our lives, in what ways we're going to discover ourselves. And sexuality is just one major way that we can discover who we are and share that with other people.
Again, it's so awesome that you are speaking up about this. I want to touch on the something that you talked about earlier, when women and men are taking SSRIs or other antidepressants and other medications, it can really mess with our sex hormones. So what do we do if we are prescribed these medications, we're on them, they make us feel better and able to get through our day-to-day lives, but we're no longer craving sex with our partners or even ourselves? What can we do to improve our libido?
So for this book, I interviewed a young woman. She's probably 30 years old when I interviewed her. And she was on an SSRI. She was in a really stable relationship, a partnership with a guy for the first time in a long time. She had a lot of sex with a lot of people, a lot of different people earlier in her life before she got sober. And she was finding that the SSRI that she was on was like playing havoc with her sexual response. Like sometimes women, I don't know very much about men. I think sometimes men can have like erectile dysfunction or orgasmic problems, maybe more with SSRIs. It just takes them a longer time to have an orgasm. I think women can sometimes have the same difficulty, and I think they can also have like less sexual desire. And this person was just finding that it was interfering with her response while she was having sex. And she said she would just take like a Zoloft break, is what she put it. Like she would take like 5 minutes away from thinking that the medication was fooling with her response. And somehow for her, that worked. Now, I think it's a really tricky problem because people need to be able to recover from depression. I think also that it's a real issue that antidepressants are actually not as effective as they're made out to be. There was a major story in the New York Times about that this week. There was a huge study done about antidepressant effectiveness. And they're more effective in certain situations. And I've read a lot about this. They're more effective in short-term situations than long-term. And depression itself actually remits, it eases on its own without medication. But if people are having, suicidal thoughts or whatever, they need to be able to feel like there's help. So I think one thing that we can do is ask our physicians, what medication will not fool with my sexuality? I think it's just important to be able to say that in a clinical situation. People don't actually look after their sexual health in that way. And physicians are not used to like sharing those kinds of side effects with patients. Like I've never voluntarily been told by a physician, yeah, this might actually mean that you don't have as many orgasms. I mean, this is important information. So if we want to have this information, we have to ask for it. And then we need to discuss with them. Like I had a situation last year in which I felt like I was having trouble getting out of bed, and I maybe needed an antidepressant. And I asked the psychiatrist, what are the options? Like if I can't take these other medications, what are my options? And he came up with a list of medications for me that I could try.
That wouldn't affect your libido.
That's right. Yeah. So why
aren't these being readily prescribed then? I mean, really?
Well, that is a really good question. And it's a question that has to do with pharma marketing and physicians' relationships with pharma. And, I think as much as anything, the fact that a lot of change in any market comes from consumers. So we as consumers have to be insisting, look, we want this to be an issue in our healthcare. If we want to take care of our depression, we don't want it to affect this other serious part of our life at the same time.
And I can imagine that this is a really hard conversation for people to have even with themselves. I am someone that has not been on an antidepressant, so I can't really speak to it from a personal standpoint, but I'm wondering if sometimes we use the lack of libido because of the medication that we're on, which is a physiological side effect, if sometimes then that becomes the way that we tell our partner, I'm just not interested, like where we almost get used to that feeling of not having a libido, not being horny, not wanting to engage in sex. And we almost get to a point where we like not having to have sex with our partner because we're so used to it being that way, and we don't even want to engage in sex anymore, where we're feeling so disassociated or dissociated from our bodies and our sex drive and our partners that we almost use the drug as an excuse to not have to feel those feelings anymore. And I'm never ever saying that people are using medications improperly or that they don't need them to help get through depression. Again, I'm not somebody that has taken them, so I don't even know how that would feel, but I am somebody who I have had lower libido and almost used
You mean
it.
just spontaneously or what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I first got sober. So when I first got sober, I was so afraid of having sex. I didn't know how to do it. I felt so uncomfortable, so awkward, so embarrassed. It was so strange to get naked with this person who I'd gotten naked with, but to do it with eyes wide open and with all of my feelings, and then having to say, you know, I haven't always orgasmed with you, or I don't really like when we do that, but I do that because I know you like that. And anyway, I wasn't prepared for all of that, but all of that to just say, I wonder if that sometimes happens, that it becomes such a habit. Like I find having sex is sometimes just something that I have to add into my day, like exercise and eating well. It's something that is a habit because I want to keep that part of my relationship alive. And does that mean that I do it when I don't feel like it? No. But does it mean that there are times that I don't feel like it as much as others, but I do it because I want to, because it's part of the habit that I've created for my life? Yes. But I'm just thinking that maybe there are times that people on SSRIs or other medications that are dimming their sexual response then almost get into that habit of we just don't have sex anymore, and that's just how it is. And then it just gets so far away that that coming back is really, really difficult.
Well, I know that I used opioids that way, and I didn't even realize that I was using them that way until I got sober.
Right.
Okay, because sex was such a performance for me, because I had to do it right. I had to do it in a certain way. I had to look a certain way. I would even sometimes, this makes me ashamed to admit, but I would even sometimes like put myself into withdrawal so that I could perform, because if I was in withdrawal, I could have like multiple orgasms, and I could still have multiple orgasms, but I manipulated my sexuality that way. And I think if women have such a performance thing and a perfectionistic thing around sexuality and their bodies, I think, that it can devolve into that kind of relationship with your medication.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not, like, I think what would help with that is having a really good therapist and being able to say, you know, look, this is happening, like I'm not having orgasms, and being able to talk about sexuality with your therapist. Because if you're taking an antidepressant for depression, it would be good to be in therapy, I think.
Yeah.
And the antidepressant itself is not going to cure depression. What cures depression is being able to wait it out and be able to not just wait it out, but like adopt productive behaviors toward oneself, to care, like self-care behaviors toward oneself during the depression. Yeah, and I had another point that I was going to make, and now I can't remember what it is.
Oh, you will in a second. But I really appreciate you saying that yeah, I mean, we can really just get into that state where it's like we're all about performing, and it's just about doing this thing.
It's not even intentional.
No.
Like it might not even be intentional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is what I appreciate about what you're saying.
Yeah. And it truly wasn't for me. It was just the way that I knew how to do it, because I don't think I was ever taught how. I don't think any of us really are ever taught how. And like you said in your experience with your childhood, that it was something to be ashamed of, that it was shameful that we don't talk about sex, and we still don't. I mean, in this country and in the US and all over the world, I find that we're still really lacking in the right language to use with our children and helping them to figure it out, because so many adults haven't figured it out either.
Well, the point that I was going to make is this. I started this relationship that I'm in now when I was just about 50. So I was still having periods. I was in perimenopause, if you know what that is. It's a ghastly state for some people. Some people don't have any at all, but I had, you know, roller coaster periods. But I was still like, I didn't have my now I'm in menopause, let's say, I have this little tiny 1 or 2 pound thing that lives, it's like a little kitten that lives on the front of my belly, doesn't go away. My body is changing is what I'm saying. And because my body is changing, my orgasms are changing, my sexual response is changing. So, and of course, because I'm not in the first days of like the first weeks of a relationship, like the relationship itself changes. So like the sexuality or sexual response of the relationship changes. You know how it's different in the first days than it is after a couple of years. So like I've had to move through all of that in sobriety while talking to my partner and saying, you know, this is happening for me. Like what's happening for me is like, it just takes me a little longer. Or what's happening for me is that like, I don't lubricate as much as I used to. And that's a fact. And we have to like understand that's not our fault. That doesn't mean just because we're not as wet as we used to be, doesn't mean that we're not as into it as we used to be. We have to get comfortable saying, you know what, I want to use some lube and I want to use it again. And then I want to use it again. And I want to use it again. So, and pick out, I have 2 lubes that I can see right now. I'm in my bedroom. I mean, I have 2 sitting on my nightstand. And I just think it's so important to bring that into the discussion. So our bodies change, you know, like it's not just getting sober that changes our body, like life changes our body. And sobriety is about like moving through all of that with integrity and with humor. Yeah, and community.
I love that. Humor and community.
Yeah.
So talking about this stuff, that's the deal, right? Being able to talk about this stuff. So how do we do it? Where do we do it? Certainly in the rooms of AA. I know that a lot of people share that that's where they can finally kind of talk openly about this stuff. But you mentioned that early in your book, you know, sex is mentioned 164 times or something in the first, or 560 times the first 164 pages, whatever it is. And yet
it's not very much actually in the first 164 pages, but go ahead.
But I just think that it's interesting that that a lot of the time that we're also hearing the message, never ever get into a relationship when you first get sober. Like stay away from sex, stay away from relationships. And it's like, well, what are we supposed to be, you know, and I get that. And I do think that there is a point to be made that spending some time with ourselves, getting to know who we really are, learning our own sexual response when we get sober and kind of playing around with that is important. But do you, and I know you talk about it in the book, but what are your thoughts on staying abstinent for at least a year after getting sober?
Well, I have a whole chapter about this in the book, you know. I mean, my thoughts are that 1 year is like arbitrary, you know. I think in general, it's a super good idea, like while you're in detox and in post-acute withdrawal or whatever you experience while your body is healing. And it's like the ultimate goal here is to take care of yourself first and learn how to do that first. And especially, I don't know, do mostly women come to your side, or do you have, I guess you have men and women?
We've got both.
Yeah. But I was just going to say, since I'm talking to a woman and you know how it is being a woman, you know, we take care of other people first. We tend to anyway. So I just think, and I think even for men, you know, men are enculturated to be providers. And if they're in relationships, they're there to take care of the other person, or even a whole family. So the idea is to take care of yourself first. And then I think, you know, it's important to, they say no big changes in the first year. So like, don't get divorced in the first month or whatever. I think in general, it's good to listen to that advice in the first days. But I think what's most important is to listen to your own intuition and your own imagination for your life, and listen to your body. Yeah. And you know, if it's like 6 months and you find something that you think is going to teach you something, or that you can teach somebody else, then you're going to learn mutually, then what the hell? Like, why listen to an arbitrary rule?
Yeah, I saw you're about to say something else, but I wanted to say it's almost like okay. to me like religion, where it's, you know, take what works and leave the rest. And if you find yourself 4 months into recovery and you meet an amazing person, I agree with you. I don't think that there should be any type of rule to keep me away from that.
Yeah, as long as nobody's going to get hurt. The main thing is like not to hurt people, you know, because we can, I mean, I know a lot of people disagree with the 12 steps idea of taking inventory and making amends. But I think, you know, when you're involved in a long-term obsession and compulsion situation, and self-absorption, which is what I think substance use disorders are about, we do really hurt other people. And it's important to like make sure that we at least don't get into another situation where we're going to hurt somebody.
Yeah.
And we can get preyed upon. We really can, like especially if you're detoxing from opioids and your libido is going through the roof, you can really get into a situation where, you think it's awesome and love and the one true thing, but it turns out, your judgment isn't all that great in the beginning.
So is there a point then to be made to wait, coming off, again, I don't have experience with opioids. I'm just, I used alcohol as my drug of choice, but would you recommend giving yourself some time while you're tapering off and then while you're getting clean from opioids to?
Yeah, I think sometime, but I think it, when you start to be able to trust your own judgment is when you can go out and share your body with somebody else that you don't know yet. Yeah,
absolutely. How long have you been sober?
My sober date is the 3rd of January 2010. So over 8 years.
Yeah, well done. And when did you write? You wrote Sex in Recovery in 2014?
Was it 2014? I think it was 2016.
Oh, was it?
2014 was
that The Recovering Body?
Yeah.
That makes sense. Who did you write Sex in Recovery for?
I wrote it for anyone who is, anyone that's new in recovery, or anyone with time, but anyone who needs to pay attention to their own body and their own sexual response inside recovery. Because, I talk to people with long-term recovery, like over 30 years, and they found it helpful to even tell their stories about sexuality.
I think that's really important, that it doesn't matter how long you've been in recovery. It doesn't matter how long you've been sober. It doesn't matter how long you've been alive on the planet. I think that I think everybody, you mentioned this in the book too, that everybody can benefit from talking about sex and sexuality.
Especially our children. I wish that I could tell you a story about, how my son wanted me to talk to him about sexuality when I was at the very same moment that I was getting into a relationship, he was getting into a relationship. It's almost like our lives have paralleled each other in some ways. But yeah, like I think our children especially will benefit from our openness around sexuality, because they need to be told from an early age that it's okay, their bodies are okay, they're healthy and normal, that their sexual responses when they're 2 or 3 or 4, when they're, starting to explore their own bodies, that it's okay for them to do that, that it, I was told that it was a mortal sin.
Yeah.
And look how I turned out. So I've raised my son to understand that his body is normal and healthy and beautiful, and that he can enjoy it in private with himself, and he can decide to enjoy it with other people in private.
Those are such awkward conversations. Again, I'm not a mom.
I thought it was a boring conversation, but he actually invited me to have it with him. Yeah, it was a pretty amazing conversation. Not every parent would agree with what I told him, but because some parents don't think their children should have sex until marriage. I personally think that that's unrealistic, because we're getting married later and later, and we can't expect our children to be abstinent from sexuality until they're 30. That's just not realistic.
Well, and the research shows that holding kids back from learning about sex does not create the result that was intended, right?
That's right.
They end up having premarital sex more regularly. Then they have so much misinformation. They learn things from friends. They don't have the facts that parents could otherwise sort of pave that foundation for them, at least creating that kind of foundation.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's a big deal. So I have a million questions that I would love to ask you about sex and all the different things about sex, but I do think that it's important to kind of stick to, we talked about the book and we've talked about your story, because I really wanted to cover that. But are there any sort of tips and tricks that you can help anybody out there watching who is new into sobriety, who is struggling maybe in a relationship or being single in early sobriety, someone that's just decided to get sober and they're freaking out because they're like, I don't know how to do this. Maybe they're an older person who hasn't been in a relationship for a long time.
Oh, I know. One person comes to mind who wrote me recently. Yeah. Who has sobriety, long-term sobriety, and she hasn't had sex for like 8 years. I don't know. I'm not a sex expert. you know. I'm not a clinician. I mean, I always say that. So I think the most important thing is to be able to know oneself. And if you are really freaking out, there are places that you can turn to for help, you know. I mean, you should be able to like begin talking about this somewhere, and one good place is a therapist. So get some therapy. If you're freaking out inside of a committed relationship, you can get couples therapy about it. But I think there are so many places to get help about it. But the bottom line is that you need to be able to talk about it with someone. You can't expect yourself to deal with it all by yourself or solve it all by yourself. And the other thing that I would just urge you to remember is that it's just a day-by-day process. You know, you just go through it day by day. Yeah, and feelings pass and bodies change, and you'll find your space.
I think that's great advice, and just that opportunity to explore on our own. And it is a topic that so many of us just don't have a lot of experience with. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about our sexual response or how we feel about things or what turns us on. We just don't spend a lot of time thinking about those things, or playing with ourselves, or spending time with ourselves to find out what it is that turns us on.
A lot of us avoid all that, and we avoid putting words to it or expressing it in any kind of way. We sort of don't think about it until we have our clothes off, and then we think about it, and then we put our clothes back on and stop thinking about it again. Some of the most helpful sexuality stuff that I've read has come from Tantra, and also orgasmic meditation. I mean, there are people who practice orgasm as a kind of energy, a life energy. And that's the way I think about sexuality, as a life energy that I'm entitled to. And it moves throughout my body. And sometimes it doesn't move, and that's okay too. Like, I cannot expect myself to orgasm on call. That's the way that I expected myself to live. And, you know, I don't have to do that. I don't have to have an orgasm if I don't want to have an orgasm. So that's one of the biggest lessons that I learned. And so there's a lot to be gained from reading about Tantra and sort of meditative pleasure.
And there's so much available online for people that are nervous to actually speak to another human. There's so much that you can find out online, but I do
talk
think
to our cats or our dogs, but another human.
That's a good idea. Talk to your animals about this stuff. They're just going to look cute at you. You're going to feel weird, but that's okay. I love it. But I do think that there's such a point to be made that we cannot cut off this important, fundamental part of the human experience of being a human. We have this opportunity to feel things and experience sex and pleasure, and so often we restrict it for whatever reason, like you did when you were a child, and other people restrict it later in life, or we use it to control, or we use it as a power play with partners. We, you know, restrict sex because we want to get back at them, or we want them to do something for us, so we use it as a bargaining tool. And you know, for all of these reasons, like we're missing the mark when it comes to appreciating and enjoying our sexual side of the sexual side of ourselves. We're oftentimes just not exploring it to its fullest potential. And I think that just like with someone who wants to run a marathon, they train for that. If they want to get healthy, they start eating better, they start preparing their own meals, learning recipes. Like, these are all things that can be trained and taught and learned. So can, you know, we can look at the topic of sex in the exact same way, that we, just because we have sex this way doesn't mean we always have to. But I do agree that it comes down to communication, first with ourselves and then with somebody else as a partner. So I think this conversation has opened my eyes even more, and I've loved every moment of it. I want to ask you a couple of last questions before we go. I want to ask you, what is the best thing about being clean and sober?
Owning my life. I think it's owning my life, and just that sense that I told you before about the arms are being around me, like understanding that I have so much more to discover about myself, and being able to give that all back. I mean, I started one of the earliest blogs about addiction and recovery, that to treat addiction and recovery as public health issues. And I've never tried to earn anything from it. I've always just tried to give it as a public service. And so I realize that I have so much to give in my life.
You definitely have so much to give. You're such a giver and a lover and just an amazing woman.
Get out.
I'm so happy I've had a chance to meet you. And it was funny, we met in New York City and we were passing in the night. Like I was coming in with my luggage, I think, and you were running out because you said a friend needs me at an AA meeting and I'm going. And I was like, you're missing Glennon? And you're like, yes, I gotta go. And I found that
a great experience too, going to a meeting with a friend in New York on the spur of the moment. Yeah.
I found that really profound that you would, you were all set to be at this event and something else pulled you away and you knew what you needed to do for you. And I found that, that brave, and I found that commendable. And I understood in that moment, how profound your recovery is for you and how deeply you care for other people. So you're, like I say, I'm really happy to know you. Thank you so much for this.
Thanks, Sarah. And it goes right back at you too. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you. And I thought I'd mention, so Guinevere Gets Sober is the name of your blog, but to find you, what is the best place for people to just find you, find everything about you?
My website, jennifermatesa.com, has everything about me. And you can email me at that website. And you can also find me a lot on Facebook. You can follow me, my author page on Facebook. And so you can find out about me there too.
Fantastic. Well, I know you're going to be meeting a lot of new people after them listening to this conversation, because I know it's a big one. It's such a big topic. Thank you for being here with me, Jen. I've really loved our time.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. To get access to all of the free videos and interviews, visit sobrietystartshere.com.